Christine Middleton Crittenden was born on Christmas Day, 1891. She remembered women's suffrage and receiving the right to vote in 1920. She never missed an opportunity to exercise her right, and she used her voice to speak for those who don't yet vote, children. After her husband George died, she lived with her daughter, my father's older sister, Lavinia. In 1972, Lavinia told her mother she wouldn't take her to the polls if she was going to vote for that liberal, hippie-loving Democrat, George McGovern. My Mimi told Lavinia she would take the bus to go vote. That was one time of many they canceled each other out at the ballot box. I also take every opportunity to vote at every level to honor my family's iron-jawed angel, Christine Middleton Crittenden.
I just turned 13, so in the United States, I'm not legally allowed to vote yet, but voting is already very important to me. In school, I love history, social studies, world cultures, etc., and I'm pretty excited to be able to vote, but quite honestly, I don't really know anything about politics. What I do know is this. I know that like many other important subjects and topics, the school system in the US doesn't teach young people much about government, politics, voting, etc. Really, the only way young adults learn about these topics is by going to college. Which is great if that is what you want to do in life, but what about the people who just want to go out into the world? Because of our school systems and the lack of information they provide, it can be hard for the people that come straight out of high school to vote. As a young Caucasian adult, I will definitely, but sadly, have some advantages. With voting, my voice will have a higher chance of being listened to and heard. While at my local polling place, I will most likely be offered more help and have an overall better experience than a person of color might. It would probably be the same for me if I were to run for any of the elections in the United States. I know this, but I also know that as a woman, I will definitely have some disadvantages when it comes to voting and other political things. I recognize that as a white person, I have more advantages than a person of color just because of my skin tone, and will try my best to learn and use my privilege to raise the voices of others and fight for racial equality. I recognize that as a young woman, I will have to raise my voice sometimes to be heard, and will help continue the fight for women's rights, especially to keep our right to vote. I recognize that we are all different, but believe that we are also at the same time all the same. We all deserve basic human rights, but also much more. We deserve to be heard, to be mad, to have fun, to be us. We are all human beings who deserve to be treated as equals, and when I grow up, I will use my power to vote and encourage others to use theirs to fight for just that.
Traveling is one of the best ways to open up the mind. It enhances personal growth. After my visit from Madrid, Spain in 2018, being exposed to new people, new places, and the culture, it gave me a wider view on life. Stepping out of my comfort zone to different environments made me aware of what was going on in my hometown. It has truly helped with understanding political situations, the economy, and social structure a bit more. It has encouraged me to vote for the first time. This year happens to mark the 100th anniversary of women's rights to vote. It's such an honor for a young independent woman like me to live in this memorable moment. Like Jovita Ibar said, proudly raise your chins and face the fight.
Say their names. Black women supported the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage movement. However, we have almost always been left out of its history. White women then and now want our support, but do not want to include us. Just like white women attempted to co-opt the Me Too movement, started by Tarana Burke in 2006. I want the names of the many African American women that were excluded from the white suffragettes groups, suffered racism, but supported and were seen but not mentioned in the history of the suffrage movement. This list was compiled by Dr. Rosalind Terburg Penn, the foremost authority on African Americans in the suffrage movement. Say their names: Sojourner Truth, Charlotte Vendine Fortin, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Margaretta Fortin, Harriet Purvis Jr., Angelina Weld Gramenke, Charlotte Fortin Gramenke, Sarah Redmond, Charlotta Rowland, Mary Ann Shadd Carey, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Gertrude Bastille Mosel, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Carrie Langston, Mary Church Terrell, Ada B. Wells Barrett, Mary Talbert, Mrs. R. Jerome Jeffrey, Mrs. I. L. Moorman, Mary E. Jackson, Adela Hunt Logan, Mary McCurdy, Fannie Barrier Williams, Coralie Franklin Cook, Janie Porter Barrett, Naomi Talbert, Margaret Murray Washington, Anna J. Cooper, Nanny Helen Burroughs, Mamie Dillard, Victoria Earl Matthews, Lucy Laney, Eugenia Burns Hope, Josephine Bruce, Verena Morton Jones, and many, many more.
History is closer than we think. When I think about the centennial of women getting the right to vote, I think of my grandmother, Jane Bronson Hankey. She was born in 1907, a teenager when women earned the right to vote. She never missed an election, and so I wore her necklace for my portrait. In my mind, centennials are a time to reflect on big and small stories. I've been researching and writing about women's history for my entire adult life. I am grateful that more people are thinking about women's history right now, both local stories and national stories. When a friend asked me to look more closely at the movement in Dallas, I eagerly said yes. I never expected to find a connection between Barry Miller and the local movement. He was a local politician and lived in Millermore, the signature house here at Dallas Heritage Village. He is that very rare example of a politician who changed his mind due to the will of the people. What would our world be like right now if there were more politicians that listened to the people and were willing to admit they were wrong? On a more personal note, I also can't help but think of my life and the lives of so many friends. I'm single. I own property. I have an advanced degree. I run a museum. Any one of these things would have been radical not so long ago, but now it's common. I'm grateful to be ordinary. I would have been a scandalous woman a century ago. Today, we live in a world where it's hard to be optimistic about a political system. But no matter the current situation, I've always taken great comfort in history. Corruption, double dealing, self-interest, bribery, and lies, these have always been a part of our political system, but we've also always had people that have fought for the rights of others. As we are ending another election cycle, one that we know has been vicious and contentious, remember the ladies and men who fought for your right to vote. When I vote, I like to think of some of the people that made that act possible. People like Alice Paul, Minnie Fisher Cunningham, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Barry Miller, Susan B. Anthony, and so many more.
During the second wave of the women's rights movement in the 1970s, I demonstrated with armies of others for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. One of my favorite memories is of my 3 little girls marching alongside me. Actually, my youngest rode along in the wagon. If enough states ratified the constitutional amendment, my daughters would be proud to have participated in that victory. I was just proud to have them with me. In spite of this early feminism, I was interestingly too naive to realize the extent of discrimination against me personally. This, in spite of working in the highly misogynistic oil and gas business. My bosses were also my mentors. They were respectful and even protective of me, so I avoided a lot of overt sexism. But it never failed. When tendering resignations, I was always immediately offered a significant pay raise to stay. In one instance, my supervisor even admitted that they had not been paying me enough for the job I had been doing. The good old boy system was alive and working against me all along. I suppose it was just more comfortable as a young single mother to remain as impersonal as possible to everything the women's movement stood for. There is a burden that comes with awareness, after all, a responsibility to do more than just march. Fortunately, I began to wake up to all the overt and covert discrimination we, as women, continue to face. I've also grown to realize that making it personal also makes me a better advocate, no matter the cause. Incidentally, the deadline for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment was extended several times while states vacillated in their support. It was not until January of this year that the required 38 states had agreed to passage. After more than 40 years, we await only clarification of legal questions to finally make it so.
I came of age during the 1960s, an exciting, radical, boundary-busting Vietnam War and civil rights protest era. After graduating college in 1970 and teaching for 4 years, I set my sights on becoming a lawyer, a field then mostly dominated by white males. As an attorney, I would possess real power over my life and the lives of others. Though there were few attorney or judge role models for women in the early 1970s, Sandra Day O'Connor wouldn't be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court until 1981, my parents, and my grandmother in particular, preached the gospel of equality for women. I had to work hard, ask no favors, and ignore those who tried to discourage me from pursuing my goals. In 1978, I graduated from Southern Methodist School of Law in Dallas with honors, and 15% of my classmates were women. Although I faced blatant sex discrimination during my job search, I finally landed a position as the first woman lawyer at a well-known civil practice firm. Several years later, I became the only woman attorney in the Dallas office of the Federal Trade Commission. I was also a wife and mother of 2 young sons. In this day and age, young women have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Savannah Guthrie, Stacey Abrams, Elena Kagan, and Kamala Harris as role models. Women are flooding the legal field, and women make up almost 50% of first-year law school classes. Men are less likely to underestimate a woman attorney without cause, although discrimination still exists, especially for women of color who must fight both gender and racial biases. Consequently, experienced women in the legal field must offer hiring opportunities and mentoring to these new entrants. I have never regretted choosing to pursue my dream of being a lawyer, but I was fortunate in so many ways. Women are the greatest untapped potential in the world. I want to be a part of making it possible for more women to realize their dreams.
2020 should have been a huge celebration for women everywhere, a celebration of our equality. But I look around and I see fear and suffering and anger. 100 years later. Or worse yet, I see apathy. We are still fighting for our rights, our very lives, and the lives of our children. We must continue to look at the suffragettes and others who came behind them as guides for the future, and the future for those who follow us. Let us leave a legacy of strong women who refuse to quit fighting.
You don't get what you don't fight for. I think of these words by Elizabeth Warren often. I consider how it applies not only to my marriage, relationships, or my career, but it is also a constant reminder that the world I want for my children, and all children, is a world that I have to actively fight for each day. On the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment's ratification, I reflect on the plight of women before me and the obstacles ahead for young women such as my daughter that will continue to be fought for years more. To be sure, the abandonment of women of color by white women was shameful. The sheer fact that it would take decades more for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to gain the same rights to the ballot as their white counterparts is inexcusable. There's no celebration without recognition that this was far from an inclusive movement for all women. And still yet, what was so admirable and inspiring about the suffragists and other activists in our past and present is their sheer dedication to what they believe was right. The pursuit to upend norms and disrupt systems is not for the faint of heart. It is the individuals who stand up or sit in or take a kneel. The individuals who march, even during a pandemic, to fight against systemic racial oppression. Those who will refuse to let things return to normal once this virus is no longer taking its toll. These are the people that are helping create the world I so long for. Since becoming a mother, particularly during this administration, I've never felt more convicted to live my values and to not take my rights for granted. While I've marched and protested causes prior to the 2016 election, for the first time in my life, I know deeply that efforts for change need to be woven into my everyday life. Social justice work cannot be passive. We must put the active in activism. Though I may not make the same degree of sacrifices as a suffragist, I can still be intentional with my time and energy to make activism part of my family's lifestyle. I can model for my children what it means to be a citizen. There will always be a critical election, a cause that needs attention and advocacy, or an oppressive leader that needs to be checked. The work is never over. Ratifying the 19th Amendment was momentous, sure, but it was not a victory with finality. Voting rights is still very much an issue today, so we continue to fight. We fight because it will not be handed to us.